Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little black subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that black subscribe button. Really does help our audience grow, really does help our channel grow, really does help and mean more than you could possibly know. So go ahead, hit that little black subscribe button. Also, thank you to our presenting sponsor, Betfred Sportsbook and the Betfred Sportsbook app. Bet 50 on any game, get $250 in free bets. Thank you again to Betfred. Thank you again to you. Now, here is the video that you came here for, and that is the college hoops transfer portal. And so it's interesting because before I left that final Friday episode, I kind of said, like, I think the portal's pretty much done. Hunter Dickinson is committed to Kansas. Most of the big names are out, but I did warn you. I said, now just keep an eye. May 11th, that was this past Thursday. I said that was the deadline where you had to have your name in the portal if you wanted to transfer this year, and that there could be a couple of big names who decide to enter before the portal closes. Whether it's a player who's looking for a new school, a player who is in the NBA draft that is just trying to keep their options open should they want to come back to college. Well, fast forward to Thursday, and the portal is very much like that gif of the Undertaker where you thought he was dead, but he opens up the grave and he is coming back. And so this is what I want to do. I want to go through what happened in the portal while I was gone. About 3 or 4 new big names in the portal, where they could end up. An interesting development for a player that had been in the portal, Keyshawn Johnson. And then we'll talk about the 1 to 2 big commitments while I was gone. Not a ton of huge commitments, but there are a few worth discussing, including one from our king, Big Rick Energy, Rick Pitino. But we'll get to that later. Let's start with the new names that have entered the portal over the last couple weeks. And I want to start with a name that if you are a regular listener of the Aaron Torres pod, especially, by the way, in the springtime when we talk a lot of college hoops roster movement, a name that should be very familiar to you, that is Arthur Kaluma from Creighton. Why is that name familiar? It's because about a year ago, as rosters for this past season, the 2022-2023 season, were being finalized, I really liked Creighton, and it was in large part because of Arthur Kaluma. He had a breakout kind of final 10 or so games of the season, highlighted by 24 points against Kansas. Remember, Kansas 2 years ago ended up winning the national championship. Kaluma was really good. And I said on this show, I said, I really think he's coming back. This is the kind of guy that could play his way into the first round in 2023 in the NBA draft. And really, he is the guy that is going to elevate Creighton. Well, little good news and bad news from Arthur Kaluma. He didn't quite have the season that we expected, but he was still a really, really good player for a team that ended up in the Elite Eight. Finished averaging 12 points per game, about 6 rebounds per game. Should mention, by the way, he's about a 6'8", 6'9" wing, super athletic, super strong. I believe he has an NBA future. And so he played this year at Creighton. It went good, but not great. And after the season, he kind of entered the NBA draft and really did kind of the goodbye Creighton graphic that we're all, thank you for the 2 years. Blue Jay Nation can never thank you enough. But right before that deadline on Thursday, he did go ahead and remove still in the NBA draft, but put his name in the transfer portal as well. Now, what's going to be really interesting with this player, now I would argue he might be probably, in my opinion, maybe the second best player to enter the portal all offseason behind only Hunter Dickinson. What will be interesting about him is, does he decide to see the NBA draft process through? Does he stay in the draft, or does he elect to come back to college for another year? Now, what I would say is my understanding, talking to some people, sending some DMs while I was away on vacation. I couldn't even text, didn't even have cell service. But when I saw his name was in the portal, I sent a few DMs. My hunch is he ain't going back to Creighton. For whatever reason, the two sides, I don't think he's mad at them. I don't think they're mad at him, but everybody's just kind of moved on. So the options are really, does he stay in the NBA draft? Does he come back to college? I do think he is planning on seeing the NBA draft process through. I went and looked at a couple different big boards. Sam Vecini, who I think does as good a job as anybody on the NBA draft stuff for The Athletic. He had Arthur Kaluma as the number 55 prospect in his NBA draft right now. So we're talking about a fringe second round pick to an undrafted guy. And so I think we have to prepare for the possibility that this guy is coming back to college. Now, where would he land if he comes back to college? there has been one school that seems to have elevated itself out among everybody else, and that's the University of Arizona. He played his high school ball in Arizona, homecoming type deal. And oh, by the way, he is a perfect fit for what they want to do. Super athletic, get up and down. I don't think it's fair to compare him to Ben Mathurin or Dalen Terry from 2 years ago, but you can see what players of his skill set can do in that system. So yeah, I think Arizona should be considered a favorite. It's also worth noting they need a guy of his exact skill set, which is interesting because we're going to talk about another guy that they're going after, Keyshawn Johnson, in a minute. But it's also worth noting this. I think Arizona's probably got to be considered the favorite. But listen, if we've learned anything this offseason, it's that once a guy puts his name in the portal and he starts seeing what real options are out there, interesting things develop that we weren't expecting. Oh, by the way, his former teammate, Ryan Nembhard at Creighton, might be the best example of that yet. Thought he was a done deal to Arizona, ends up at Gonzaga. But I would say if he comes back to college basketball, I would expect Arizona to be the favorite. Let's keep it going with another very interesting player who entered the portal right under the deadline on, I think it was Wednesday into Thursday. Former McDonald's All-American Julian Phillips, who played last year at Tennessee. Really skilled, really athletic player, about 6'7", 6'8", and kind of an interesting story. He was a guy who was committed to, how about this, our boy Will Wade and LSU. Then Will Wade gets fired a year ago. He reopens his recruitment. It comes down to Auburn and Tennessee. And it feels like everything's trending with Auburn. And at the last second, he decides to go to Tennessee. Now, this isn't a knock on Tennessee. You guys know I love Rick Barnes, had him on the show many times. But when he committed to Tennessee, it felt like kind of a weird fit. Yes, they needed a player of his skill set. But Rick Barnes notoriously, he's not the kind of guy that is just going to put the ball in a freshman's hands and say, go make plays the way that a Coach K used to, the way that a John Calipari has, the way that an Eric Musselman has. Rick Barnes is kind of much more, you got to earn everything, you got to whatever. And so I bring it up. It always felt like a weird fit, and it just never fully clicked with Julian Phillips at Tennessee. Now, he didn't have a bad year by any stretch of the imagination, but you go back and look at this past season, a couple nice games. He did have a 25-point game in the Battle for Atlantis, that great Thanksgiving time event. But in general, it just never really clicked because Tennessee was a deep team. Tennessee is not a program that is going to just give the ball to freshmen, as I said, and let them play. And also, they're just not a very elite offensive team. Julian Phillips averaged about 8.5 points per game, 4.5 rebounds per game. But I do believe you put him in a bigger role in the right system in college basketball, I believe this guy can be a superstar, like 18 points per game, and play his way into the first round of the NBA draft next year. Now, like Kaluma, this is where it kind of gets interesting. Like Kaluma, he is testing the NBA draft waters, and because he's a year younger, I don't know if he's even more athletic, but he is a crazy athlete. The draft stock is a little bit higher for Julian Phillips, who really projects as kind of that new age 3-and-D. If you can get him comfortable shooting behind the three-point arc, he has all the tools to be that elite wing defender that every NBA team so desires. Because of it, he's probably more of an early second-round pick, probably will get drafted. So the question now becomes, does he stay in the draft, which my hunch is probably most likely. But if not, can a school convince him, hey, look, you can be a second rounder and you can do whatever and make your money and try to be on your way. Or you can come play with us for a year. We believe we can play you into the first round in our system. Now, in terms of what schools stand out, the ones that probably to me make the most sense, I've heard since before even enter the portal that Auburn would be very interested in a player of his skill set. Like some of the pieces that Auburn has coming back, assuming Janai Broome, their star center, ends up coming back as well. But Auburn, I think, is one that's natural. He almost picked them over LSU coming out of high school, almost picked them over Tennessee when he committed last spring. So that's a school worth following. I've heard some rumblings of Texas. Texas is all out on those five-star freshmen, but have done a good job in the portal with Max Abmas and a few other guys. But Julian Phillips, he's another one. If he seriously considers coming back to college basketball, he is going to hear from just about everybody in the sport, and it'd be fascinating to see where he ends up. Let's keep it going with a couple new names in the portal, or new names that we haven't talked about. Really quickly, Ernest Udeh Jr. from Kansas, very interesting name. And it is proof that even for the best teams, the portal giveth and the portal taketh away. That's because shortly after Hunter Dickinson ended up committing to Kansas, Ernest Udeh Jr., who's really a really nice piece, but probably a project. He's a year away from being a year away, or maybe that's not even fair. Maybe he's just a year away. Probably a guy that really could have been a breakout kind of star as a junior. He was going into his sophomore year, decides to enter the portal after the commitment from Hunter Dickinson at Kansas. So Kansas's Ernest Udeh is now in the portal. Listen, the stats don't jump off the page for this guy, but he is a developmental big. But I'll say this. I think there's sometimes we use the word developmental, and even a best case development, I think the ceiling is still like good college player. This guy, I think, is like all-American NBA player if he develops the way that he, the way that you would want him to. And so now it just becomes a question of where would that fit be? Again, he averaged about 2.5 points, 2 rebounds per game, but Bill Self, like Rick Barnes, isn't the kind of guy that is just going to, just throw a freshman out there and let him go. But despite it, let's make no mistake, this is a kid that is very much in demand. This is a kid that is very much in demand since he has hit the portal. He was a McDonald's All-American. Again, a guy that I think just about everybody is going to have interest in now that he has entered the portal. I've seen a couple lists of things with him and who could be recruiting him. Again, I believe he is a player that just about everybody will be interested in. And we will see where he ends up as far as that's concerned. One last player that I do want to talk about who's not really new to the portal, but is a very interesting name and a guy that, listen, we're going to do it in a minute with Mackenzie Mbako, who's not a transfer. He's a high school player. But sometimes in life, I just got to take an L. And I got to take an L because there is a player that I have not talked about enough in this portal cycle who I actually really like a lot. And shame on me, give myself a little slap on the wrist that I have not discussed him earlier. And that's Keyshawn Johnson of San Diego State. He entered the portal probably about 2 weeks after San Diego State's dream run to the national championship game and really had a quiet recruitment. And then right before I left for vacation, he ends up releasing a Final 5, and it appears as though with his final visits done, he's really down to 2 schools, Arizona and Kentucky. Now, we just talked about Arizona and their need for kind of a big wing. I want to talk about Kentucky in a minute, but before we do, let me tell you a little bit about Keyshawn Johnson, because again, it's really on me that I haven't done a better job of talking about this kid. Because what I can tell you is I love this kid, okay? And I think most people know I live on the West Coast. Because of it, I'm just allowed to watch more Mountain West basketball than most of you guys and girls. I understand most of you live on the East Coast. Most of San Diego State's games start at 10 or 10:30 or 11 p.m. your time. But I've watched San Diego State for years. And this is a kid that has always jumped out to me, okay? This is a kid that's about 6'8", 6'9", super athletic. Like you even, like San Diego State was one of the deepest, most athletic teams in college basketball this year. And even on that team, over the last 2 or 3 years, that is a kid that has jumped out. And I remember watching him about a year or two ago. I said, that's an NBA player right there. That's at least an NBA frame. And if he develops, that is an NBA player right there. And it's interesting because it's never really kind of totally clicked in terms of I thought he'd be an all conference guy, a 2nd round pick, all that. And it was funny because I just mentioned Sam Vecini and I saw him at the Final Four and I almost asked him super randomly. Cause remember, San Diego State was there. Like, is Keyshawn Johnson an NBA player? Because I believe that he is. 6'8", plays really hard, super athletic, super long. And he's just a player that I really like. Now, the one thing he does not do well, he does not shoot the 3 ball well. I think everybody who's listening this far into the segment knows that. But he does just about everything else well. He's been part of winning teams. If you don't play defense at San Diego State, you are not going to be on the floor. And so now the interesting part, again, becomes where does he end up? I'll be blunt. I always try to be transparent with you guys and girls. Traveling, don't have a great feel for if anybody truly leads. But as I said, it feels like all indications are he just visited Arizona. He just visited Kentucky last week. And that Kentucky might, that those 2 are probably the favorites to land him. So why do I bring it up? We just talked about Arizona's need for a big wing. Let's talk about Kentucky. Because Kentucky fans, I will say this. I've been critical of John Calipari. You need to be more aggressive in the portal. I believe if John Calipari gets this guy, this is the perfect player for who Kentucky needs and what they need out of a player. Before we go further, I know what Kentucky fans are going to say, oh my God, Torres, blah, 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 blah. He's not a good three-point shooter. Well, let me just say this, okay? If Keyshawn Johnson was a 37% three-point shooter, I'm just going to tell you right now, the dude would be in the NBA. Like, the dude would not be in the portal looking for somewhere to play college basketball. But so you look at everything else that Kentucky needs. Size on the wing, athleticism on the wing, defensive versatility, a veteran presence on a team that, as I mentioned on the last episode, Kentucky has right now 5 freshmen, 2 players that are going into their second year on campus that are developmental guys. They need adults in that locker room. And so that's why I like Keyshawn Johnson. I believe he checks all of the boxes. And the one thing I'll say is this, is I've heard some stuff about 2 things. Is one, that, you know, he should go to Arizona because he would start at Arizona and he would come off the bench at Kentucky. And I've also heard this from the Kentucky perspective, and I'm not criticizing anybody, but, oh, he played a role at San Diego State, and so that's why he wants to, and that's why he'd be comfortable coming off the bench at Kentucky. I don't believe that to be true at all. Let me explain why. When I was at the Final Four this year, the one thing that struck me was that San Diego State had a bunch of dudes that were just fully bought into, like, the sum is greater than the parts. This is how we win. We play 10 or 11 guys, whatever. Agueka Rop was one of my favorite players all year. He unfortunately just had a very personal situation go on in his life, lost a younger brother. But I bring it up because I remember talking to him. He's like, dude, I love this school. I love my teammates. I love my coaches. I don't mind being the 6th man. Jaden Leday, 5th-year guy who redshirted last year. Like, who redshirts anymore? And he volunteered to redshirt. So San Diego State had a bunch of dudes. Some is greater than the parts. But Keyshawn Johnson was really the one guy that when all the San Diego reporters kind of asked him, hey, you got this extra COVID year, what are your plans? For the most part, they all he was the one guy that said, we'll see at the end of the year. I'm not committing to anything. And so I bring it up because, listen, whether it's Arizona or Kentucky or one of his other 3 finalists. Now, I do think USC, is out. They took DJ Rodman, Dennis Rodman's son. But I bring it up because any of his 3 schools, I think he's going there to start, and I think he's going there to play big minutes. And I know what a Kentucky fan will say, oh, there's no room for him in our front court. Really? Because you're taking him to replace Chris Livingston if Chris Livingston stays in the NBA draft. So you think Chris Livingston is going to come back to Kentucky and not start? Because if you think Keyshawn Johnson isn't going to start, then you need to think that Chris Livingston isn't going to start, and that's not really the case. And so I'm rambling, but I believe this guy is coming to Kentucky because he knows there is a specific need for his specific skill set. And I will see what Oscar Tshiebwe does. I understand that Aaron Bradshaw, the 5-star center, does consider himself to be more of a new age 5, a Giannis that can handle the ball and do everything. Listen, you get him there and you figure it out. If you can get Keyshawn Johnson, you do. He commits next Sunday. So there's no doubt that whether it's Arizona, Kentucky, or someone else, we will be talking about him. One final note in the portal. We talked about a lot of guys that have entered. I do want to take about 10 minutes to talk about a player that committed while I was gone. His name, Jordan Dingle. Okay, Jordan Dingle played at Penn, 6'3" guard, the 2nd leading scorer in all of college basketball last year, averaged 23.5 points per game. He entered the portal. He's another one testing the NBA draft waters, but he did commit on Friday. And do you know who he committed to? That's right. My buddy, Big Rick Energy, Rick Pitino, and St. John's. And let me say this. Let's break down who Jordan Dingle is. But I believe, and I'm not kidding when I say this, I think Rick Pitino has already created an NCAA tournament team in one offseason in St. John's. And so let's break down who this kid is, because he's not only a really good player, but he's exactly who St. John's needs. 23.5 points per game, can create off the dribble, very good 3-point shooter, doesn't really get others involved. Kind of a new age scoring guard. Put the ball in my hands, I'm going to go make plays. Not to say he's selfish or anything like that, just he's wired to score. So he is a great fit for St. John's. he is going to come in and be able to score in the Big East. Now, is he going to average 23 a game? Of course not. But can he average 16 a game, 16 and a half per game, 17 per game? I believe he absolutely can. And so you now take that skill set with what St. John's retained with the previous coaching staff, which is basically one player, and the players that Rick Pitino has brought in. I like this team a lot. So first off, the most important piece that Rick Pitino has outside of Jordan Dingle, he retained a really good center named Joel Soriano. And if you don't know Joel Soriano, it's because, let's be honest, St. John's kind of wasn't really on anybody's radar under Mike Anderson. Soriano averaged 15 and a half points per game, 12 rebounds per game, 1.5 blocks per game. This guy's just a low down low. And Rick Pitino is going to be able to get even more out of him next year. There's a reason that this was basically the only player that Rick Pitino retained off last year's roster. On top of that, St. John's has also added a bunch of dudes from Iona, some great three-point shooting. The kid Sean Conway from VMI. And on top of that, in the last couple of weeks, it's really when Rick Pitino went to work. As our Torres on St. John's account likes to say, Rick is cooking, baby. Added Glenn Taylor, averaged 12 and a half points per game at Oregon State. Bigger, kind of wingish guard, can make plays. And RJ Luis, 6'7", 6'8", forward, 11 and a half points per game at UMass last year. This is a guy, I think he's going to be good next year. If Pitino can keep him for a junior, senior year, this guy has all Big East type talent. And so when you look at all the pieces, I'm just telling you, I believe that in one offseason, Rick Pitino has developed an